Hello, folks. Welcome to the the True Vine YouTube channel. I just want to talk a little bit this evening about the nature of atheism and why I believe it is basically a belief which has a dead end and is self-defeating for a number of reasons. I think it's just not capable of answering the big questions in life. So I'll just go through some of those questions here. The first one, if you think, according to the theory of naturalism, which is the belief that nothing except physical matter exists, there's a number of questions you have to ask. Why is the universe so orderly? Why isn't it utterly chaotic? Where do the laws of nature come from? We know that the laws of nature are highly consistent. They never change. They never change from one part of the universe to another. So something is making that consistent. There must be a reason for that consistency. Back in the days of paganism, people used to believe that the gods were responsible for what happens in the universe. They believed in capricious gods who would one minute grant them favors, good crops and good weather and so on. The next day they would destroy their crops and give them bad weather. And then theism, the belief in a god, came along, and that started the belief that the universe is actually orderly. So we have the understanding today that the universe is orderly, that there is rhyme and reason to it, and it's not utterly chaotic. The next question then is, why is the universe fine-tuned? And what I mean by that is that there are a number of the constants of physics. So I'm talking about things like the mass of the electron, the mass of a proton, the speed of light. All these things are highly finely tuned, and physics cannot explain to us where these values come from. They can tell you the precise value, but they cannot say what it was that, let's say, turned the control knobs to set those particular values. There is no explanation for that. And in fact, those values are so highly tuned that if you changed, some of them are so highly tuned that if you change them by the slightest degree, we could not exist. Human beings could not exist. So the next question is, how did life begin? We are led to believe that life began in some sort of a primordial soup, which is a bunch of chemicals, and somehow all the molecules necessary for life randomly came together with no rhyme or reason, just happened to come together, and we were told that it happened so many times it eventually produced a self-replicating life form. Back in the day when that kind of thought was happening in science, they didn't actually understand the complexity of molecular biology, the complexity of DNA and the machinery that's actually contained in every cell in an organism. The next question is, why does mathematics have the ability to model the universe? And in a related comment, question, how can the symbols on a chalkboard describe precisely what happens in reality? So we understand the workings of a universe to a very high degree. There are still a number of, at the very frontiers or the edge of our scientific understanding, there are still some unknown factors there. But for all practical purposes, mathematics describes what we see in the universe very accurately. So the question is, how is it possible that mathematics, a set of symbols, can describe what happens in reality? That is a mystery that philosophers wrestle with. Next question then is, why do we have consciousness? And when you think about it, at some point in the past, around 13.8 billion years ago, the universe exploded. At that point, there were only light elements. We started off with hydrogen, and as clouds of gas started to form, they got heavier and heavier. The force of gravity compressed all that gas, and that eventually, when enough matter accumulated, the force of gravity was so strong that it forms stars, and inside those stars, in those furnaces, all the heavier elements were produced. So I'm talking about elements like helium, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, potassium, all those different elements that are required for life. They were formed in those stars. So when you think about it, they eventually, all that the material from, so the stars exploded and all the material arrived on a planet, and we are led to believe that that matter came together in a brain, and that brain is capable of being self-conscious. So it's conscious of the world around it, and it's also self-conscious, able to look inwardly. So the question is then, how can physical matter, which exploded from the Big Bang and became stars, and those stars exploded, and that matter eventually formed brains, how is that matter, physical matter, conscious of anything? How is that possible? And some scientists, for example Daniel Dennett, actually believes that consciousness is an illusion, that we don't actually have consciousness. But yet we all, from experience, clearly know that we are conscious beings. We're conscious of everything around us, and we're conscious of ourselves, and we're conscious that we are conscious, and so on. You can have kind of an infinite regress of consciousness. The next question, so are all thoughts the result of chemical reactions? Chemical reactions happen, electrical signals flow, and there's nothing you can do to control that. It just does what it does. So when you mix oxygen and hydrogen, that reaction takes place, and you generally can't control it unless you do something to change the mixture or something, So what I'm saying is that if our thoughts are supposedly the result of physical chemical reactions, it means that effectively that we have no free will. If those reactions are bound to happen and we can't control the course of those reactions, then our thoughts supposedly are basically the function of a machine. It's like winding up a clock, and you let it go, it just does what it does. You cannot change the course of what that clock does unless you have some external intervention. So if our minds are nothing but more than the result of chemical reactions, how can we trust our thoughts? How can we know that what we believe is true? I mean, it could be utter nonsense, but yet we do believe that our thoughts are true. And likewise, how can physical matter produce intelligence? A mind that's capable of coming up with solutions to problems. And there's another question which I haven't got there, which is there a difference between the mind and the brain? How can a purely physical brain understand the workings of the universe? So again, we're the product of exploding stars. How is it that what's essentially the waste material of exploded stars, how can that waste material come together and begin to understand the universe and formulate equations, mathematical equations, to describe the structure and function of the entire universe? It's a massive mystery. I dealt with this already. How can there be free will? Then we have the question of, where does morality come from? Moral obligations. So we do all have moral obligations. We have obligations to preserve human life, let's say, or not to kill people, or not to steal. Where do these moral obligations come from? Are they social constructs, or something very, very real written into our being? So, for instance, I might see someone in front of me drop some money. I have got the choice to either tap him on the shoulder and say, "You drop some money," or you can pocket that money. Um, that again is going back to free will. Was that an actual real decision that I made, or did those chemical reactions force me to do that? Next question is the purpose or meaning to life. Again, if we are nothing but physical matter, it means that when we die, our being is gone. Where our life, our self, no longer exists. And in that situation, why is there any purpose to life? Why bother living? Um, According to Richard Dawkins, he said that the universe is basically a blind, pitiless, indifferent universe, and our purpose in this world is to propagate DNA. In other words, to self-replicate. Now, it's interesting to note that if you look at the demographics of atheists, they are probably the least. They would have the least children of any group, say compared with, let's say, Muslims, who would have the highest. So it turns out that religious believers are doing a better job of propagating DNA than atheists. So it doesn't work out terribly well for atheists if what Richard Dawkins is saying is true. Next question is, why do we feel guilt or have a conscience? Where does that come from? Again, if we are nothing more than physical matter, essentially there is no right and wrong. What happens happens. We essentially, our thoughts and our actions are the result of electrical activity and chemical reactions. So, is there ever any guilt in what we do? If we do something wrong, is it actually wrong? I don't see how it could be. If it's all down to chemical reactions, a person who murders someone cannot really be guilty, because the chemical reactions made them do it. And if that's the case, why put people in jail? If they're bound to do it by physics. Next question is, what happens when we die? Obviously, that is a huge question that cannot be answered by atheism. None of us, I don't think anybody likes the idea of dying. I don't think anybody's comfortable with that idea. Some people have a kind of a stoical attitude that basically, when you die, that's the end of it. Just live with it, suck it up. But I think deep down we all have a fear and a dread of dying. And if you're an atheist, you certainly believe that when you die, yourself, your very existence, your memories, all your hopes and dreams, that all ends with death. It's a very, very uncomfortable thought. And also, the universe itself will end. I mean, the sun has got a finite life. At the moment, we are in a period, I think it's in terms of the sun's cycle. The sun's a star, obviously, and it is. I think it's in its minimum output phase. But that output will increase, which means the Earth is going to get hotter and hotter and hotter as time goes on. Eventually, the sun will explode, and life as we know will cease to exist. So again, under naturalism, the belief that nothing but physical matter exists, it's all going to end anyway. So again, ask the question, what's the point of it all? If we're struggling through life, why continue on? Next question is, what is the essential you? What is the thing that I call myself, and where is it located? Is it actually located in the brain? that surely is an assumption. I think everyone has a very strong sense of self. And the question is, how can physical reactions and so on, electrical activity, how can that produce a sense of self? And then for me, what is surely the ultimate question is, does God exist? And really, that has got to be the ultimate question, because it changes everything. If God doesn't exist, then there is no purpose, there is no good and evil, um, there is no goal to life. It's just, you just live, you just exist. Whereas if God exists, we are created for a purpose. There's life after death. Um, Everything we do here has a meaning and a purpose, and we're working towards something, and something which will not just be snuffed out or, you know, cease to happen, cease to exist when we die. I think in the media, popular press, and so on, I think we have basically an unbalanced view of this question, of the question of atheism versus belief in a God. Um, Popular science tells us that evolution is true, that we evolved essentially from very simple organisms like single cell amoebas and so on, and eventually evolved and evolved and evolved to where we are now. Under evolution, supposedly the goal, if there is any goal, is to survive. So if life is nothing more than a matter of survival, then other goals are pretty much thrown out the window. And those goals might be, helping your neighbor, being a good person, versus being selfish, doing your own thing. Science is ultimately based on naturalism. To my mind, that is really painting the whole human endeavor into a small box and saying that, well, nothing more than physics can possibly exist, nothing more than matter and energy and time and space, that there is nothing except those four things. But yet, from the very earliest days of human history, every culture on this planet has had the strong, very, very strong, driven belief that there is more to this world than physical matter. We hear far too much from the new atheists. I mean, the likes of Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, the late Richard Hitchens, not Richard, whatever his name is, Hitchens, and Sam Harris. We hear far too little from apologists, and apologists are people whose job it is to basically defend religious belief and faith. We hear far too little from theologians and philosophers, and actually I believe it was Stephen Hawking who said that philosophy is essentially dead and has been replaced by science, and I would utterly reject that view. I would claim that atheism is self-defeating because it robs human existence of meaning and purpose and free will, and all the good things that kind of define life on this planet. For a lot of people, science has become the new religion, and basically a lot of people think that if there isn't scientific evidence for something, then you rule it out immediately. It's impossible. And scientists, I think, for a lot of people, are the new priests. We're constantly being told that there is no evidence for God. I totally reject that. We are being told that belief in God is childish, ridiculous, weak. Why don't you grow up and just get on with it and accept that death is the end? I think that's a very, very unfortunate position for anyone to adhere to, because again, it robs our whole existence of all the things that we hold dearly, all our dreams and hopes and everything just gets mashed basically. So the question then is, how do we move on from that position, and can we move on from that position? We were often told that faith in God is blind. Now, for a lot of people, faith is a blind thing. There's no doubting that. For a lot of people, their faith is very, very simple. Their parents tell them, "Look, this is what we believe. We want you to believe the same." And a lot of people do accept that. They have a very simple, unquestioning faith. Um, for a lot of people that works. For people like me, that doesn't work because I like to ask questions. Um, what the approach I like to take is that well, my belief is that faith cannot be blind. It has to be based on reason. And what I mean by that is that you have the human. Let's say we have the human on one side, we have God on the other, and we've using reason we can work a certain distance towards God, and God on the other hand works towards us from his side, but there's always going to be a little gap there in the middle, and to get across that gap takes a leap of faith. So it isn't that belief in God is blind. There are actually lots of very, very solid scientific evidence and philosophical arguments for God's existence. So what is that evidence? I'm not going to go into these in any great detail, just to mention them very briefly here. Evidence from science includes the Big Bang itself. Science tells us that the universe began to exist about 13.8 billion years ago, and at that time there was absolutely nothing. There was no space, no time, no matter. So it's not that the Big Bang blew into space itself. Space itself didn't even exist. So in the Big Bang, space was created. So if you were there at that time, if it was possible to be there at that time, there would be no space you couldn't go from A to B because that space didn't exist. There's a thing then called the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, which proves that in any physical model of the universe, which is on average expanding, that it must have had a finite beginning in the past. And that proves that supports the Big Bang theory, that the Big Bang was actually the very, very beginning and not part of an ongoing cycle of explosion and contraction and explosion and contraction, the bouncing universe theory. That model just does not work. Scientists or physicists have tried, cosmologists, I tried to come up with models of the universe which avoid the beginning question. A lot of scientists don't like the idea of a universe with a beginning because that smacks of God. So they've tried to come up with models of the universe, what are called time eternal models, and every one of those has fallen foul of that BGV theorem, the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem. Those models just don't work. The next problem then is the fine-tuning of the constants of physics. There are, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of physics which have very, very precise values, but science cannot explain how those constants have those values that they have. There is nothing is forcing them to have any particular value. They just have those values, and science has no idea how they have those values. A second. Little bit of a glitch there in the bottom, missing part of my screen. Okay, I don't know why that is. Okay, so to move on, there are then moral arguments. So the moral arguments is, where does good and evil come from? I think we all have a very strong sense of good and evil, unless of course you're a psychopath. So I think almost everyone on this planet would agree that, let's say, torturing innocent children is a bad idea, that it's morally reprehensible. The question is, if we're nothing more than chemical reactions and atoms and so on, why is it that we have that belief? Uh, you could say, well, if I kill a child, it's nothing more than a bunch of atoms, so what's the problem? But we all know in our hearts that that is morally reprehensible. There are many arguments from Thomas Aquinas. I'm not going to detail those here. Actually, I don't know them very well. The next one then is the Kalam cosmological argument, which is an interesting one. Basically, is around cause and effect, and the basic problem here is that you cannot have an infinite regress of cause and effect. You have to have a beginning point. As you go back in time to the causes and previous causes and effects, you have to stop somewhere. You cannot have an infinite chain. So you have to have an initial point, something which is uncreated, something which has always existed, something which does not depend on anything else for its existence. And that is what philosophers call God. That last little point there is the impossibility of actual infinities. It was David Hilbert who came up with that argument, and that applies to time, that time itself cannot be infinite to the past, so it must have had a beginning. The last area then is evidence from biology. So the origin of life, again, as I said, is a huge mystery. We know that that life itself, what is contained in each cell of an organism, is incredibly complex. You have so many different types of molecules, strands of DNA. You have to have something like, maybe in a simple, very, very simple cell, 200 distinct types of proteins, these chains of proteins, the RNA, the whole lot. You have molecular machinery. You have enzymes for converting food into energy. You've mechanisms for getting rid of waste and so on. The point is about this is it's incredibly complex, far more complex than any computer or anything like that, anything that we humans could design. The other point is that if any one component of a cell, just a single cell, doesn't exist, then that cell cannot survive and it cannot replicate. So scientists have pretty much, from what I've read, scientists have pretty much given up on the idea that life occurred randomly on planet Earth. And they have come up with what is called a panspermia theory, which is the theory that life came from outer space. Really, that doesn't achieve very much. All it's doing is pushing the problem into a wider field of probability. By saying this could have happened out in the universe, you have higher probability. But as I'll probably deal with in a later video, the probabilities involved in forming even a single molecule of DNA by chance are so incredibly small, it literally has to be ruled out as impossible. So yeah, I've touched already on the complexity aspect. There is information content in DNA, and information from our own intuition and from experience and knowledge. We know that information content can only come from an intelligent agent. It cannot be produced randomly, because information is basically, it's an encoded system, which is processed data. Um, we know that we know of no examples other than life. We know of no examples in the physical world other than human life where DNA exists. So the question is, where did that information come from? You then have the intelligent design movement, something I've been following pretty closely, and that is actually doing some pretty serious damage to evolution, and is showing um, that the mechanism of DNA actually really can't account for new forms of life. So what it can do is produce macro microevolution, where changes of color happen. The change of a moth's changes in the color of a moth's wings or something, or the length of a bird's beak or something, can change randomly, but forming new components like eyes and ears and wings and so on, toes and everything, cannot just the neo-Darwinism, um, the mutation and natural selection it lacks creative power to produce new body plans. So the last point then about evolution is that evolution explains the survival of the fittest, but not the arrival of the fittest. So it explains how those creatures adapt to their environment, but not how they got there in the first place. So that is it for now. I will leave it right there, and hopefully that will give people some food for thought. So take care and all the best, and hope to see you soon. Thanks. Bye.